given everything Snowden's leaks have taught us about how the NSA operates, do today's reforms go far enough? Or for more, I'm joined now from Rio de Janeiro by Glenn Greenwald. He, of course, is the journalist who originally wrote about Edward Snowden's leaks. He's also a columnist on civil liberties and US national security issues. Thanks for joining us, Glenn. Announcing a series of concrete and substantial reforms today, Barack Obama announced sweeping changes to the way US intelligence snoops on America and the rest of the world. So mission accomplished for you and Snowden at this point?
Changes are substantial, and I certainly don't agree that they're sweeping. There are some reasonable and positive steps that he proposed, although even those are quite vague. But the essence of the NSA system that has created such worldwide anger and debate, namely that the NSA spies on hundreds of millions of people every day without even a whiff of suspicion that they've done something wrong, will be preserved even if all of President Obama's proposals are implemented. And I think the changes are far more cosmetic and symbolic than they are substantive or sweeping.
Well, let me put it to you that you're being unfair. He outlined a number of reforms that would increase transparency into the collection of metadata and the legal rationale for it. He also called for the creation of a panel of outsiders that will represent the public before the FISA court. He also said that a court order will now be required before the government can get access to that data. These are pretty substantial and substantive, perhaps is the word, given that beforehand, as you've suggested, they've just been snooping on individuals with no oversight at all.
No, they're not, actually. And if you look at the controversy that has been triggered in the United States and around the world, and what that debate has been about, I think you'll find that very little of that is actually affected in a meaningful way by what President Obama has proposed. I agree that putting an advocate before the FISA court and tightening up some of the restrictions on how foreign leaders can be spied on are good ideas, although, again, he offered very little specifics about, for example, what those standards will be or who will hold the metadata. But what has caused the controversy and the anger is the idea that we have a secret surveillance agency that every single day collects hundreds of millions, actually billions, of data points about people's telephone and email calls, even though they're completely law-abiding and innocent. And he has not proposed to end any of that or really to stop that in a meaningful way. That will endure. And that's why I think the changes are more at the margin than the center.
Perhaps for this reason, Mr. Obama didn't directly address Snowden's case today, but he did, Glenn, say that the classified information that was leaked in recent months could impact US security well into the future. And this going forward is a big problem for him. Let's just have a listen to what he said.
If any individual who objects to government policy can take it into their own hands to publicly disclose classified information, then we will not be able to keep our people safe or conduct foreign policy. Moreover, the sensational way in which these disclosures have come out has often shed more heat than light, while revealing methods to our adversaries that could impact our operations in ways that we may not fully understand for years to come.
He says you've jeopardized national security, and he can't have that.
Every single time there has been a report over the last 50 years that has disclosed that which American political leaders want to keep secret, going back to the Pentagon Papers, through the Bush era, disclosures over torture and rendition and abuses at Abu Ghraib and all sorts of other programs, including NSA abuses, the U.S. government says exactly the same thing, which is what President Obama just said. Oh, national security has been endangered by bringing transparency to our government. And there's never any evidence presented that it's true, and there's been no evidence presented here that it's true.
Glenn,
the only thing that has been damaged by the disclosures is the reputation of American political officials like President Obama.
There is also no evidence that national security hasn't been breached, that Americans aren't actually in a worse position now as a result of what you and Snowden have done. Come on.
I think that statement that you just made is as illogical as it gets. What you're actually
you told me, though,
demanding
there's zero
is that
evidence that national security has been harmed, and I'm
could
saying
you
there's zero evidence that it hasn't
if you want to make
been harmed.
excuse me. If
All
you
right,
want
go
to
on.
make statements like
Go on.
that, as inflammatory as the one you just made, you need to then remain quiet so that I can answer your question. If you just want to filibuster,
Go on,
I'll hang up and you can go and do that to your audience alone without me. I'm going to address what it is that you just said. What you're demanding is that evidence be presented of a negative. I also can't prove to you that the NSA isn't controlled by Martians. The presumption, the burden is on the government. If they want to come forward and say that national security has been damaged by these disclosures, to present evidence that their claims are true. They have a history of making that claim only for it turned out to be entirely false.
Let's bring in Glenn Greenwald, investigative journalist with First Look Media. He was the first to use information given to him by Snowden to break stories of NSA surveillance. And this spring, Glenn has a book coming out called No Place to Hide, Edward Snowden, the NSA and the U.S. Surveillance State. Glenn, thanks for being here. Let's get right to it. The president announcing 5 reforms. Perhaps the most notable one has to do with bulk phone record collection, so-called Section 215. This collection of metadata is going to continue. It's just that a third party may now be in charge of the database. Here's why President Obama argues this collection needs to continue to be stored.
The program grew out of a desire to address a gap identified after 9/11. One of the 9/11 hijackers, Khalid al-Mindar, made a phone call from San Diego to a known al-Qaeda safe house in Yemen. NSA saw that call, but it could not see that the call was coming from an individual already in the United States.
So the president argues, Glenn, that this data is used to map the communications of terrorists so law enforcement can see who they may be in contact with and see it as quickly as possible. If it's stored somewhere else, does it make sense?
Problems with that statement that he just made, which is that they're completely contradicted by everyone who has looked at that question, beginning with his own White House panel as well as a federal court judge that both said that there is zero evidence, that this metadata program is actually effective in stopping any terrorist plots, as well as leading experts in al-Qaeda such as Lawrence Wright and Peter Bergen, both of whom have said that the idea that this program would have helped stop 9/11 is ludicrous since the government had all of the data that it would have needed to stop the program and just didn't even know what it had because it had too much, which means collecting more actually makes it harder to stop terrorism problems. I think the real question is, should the government, in any form, no matter who's holding it, be forcing the retention of all of our phone data, even though we're law-abiding innocent citizens? It's really the question of who holds it, I think, is a trivial one. The bigger question is, why should the government be keeping all of this data on us at all?
Well, I guess the counter-argument would be, if they had been able to map that call to that known al-Qaeda operative and see that that individual who placed the call was actually physically in the United States, maybe something would have been different.
But Jake, nobody in the debate at all is opposed to targeted surveillance, meaning taking the people for whom there's evidence to believe they're engaged in terrorist organizations or involved in terrorist plots and placing them under very careful surveillance. The question really is, what kind of values do we have as a country? We could eliminate all sorts of crimes, Jake, like rape and murder and kidnapping and pedophilia, if we just do away with the requirement that police officers first get a search warrant before entering our house, or if we let the government put video cameras in all of our homes and offices and watch what we're doing all the time. We make the choice that we'd rather not do that because we'd rather live with a greater risk of crime than let the government invade our privacy. The fact that there's a 0.5% chance that it could have helped a terrorist plot 11 years ago in terms of detection is hardly a reason to do this massive, ubiquitous surveillance program.
Glenn, the president also noted that it's possible Americans may regret weakening the NSA's power if something terrible happens, as seems inevitable. Take a listen.
The men and women at the NSA know that if another 9/11 or massive cyber attack occurs, they will be asked by Congress and the media why they failed to connect the dots.
That's true, isn't it?
This is just fear-mongering. If you go back and listen to the statements of Bush officials whom President Obama used to routinely mock when they defended all of their war on terror programs, they would say the same thing. Our responsibility is to keep everyone safe. If we don't do this, we're going to be criticized. If you're a leader, you don't govern in fear. Oh my God, I need to do this because if I don't, people might criticize me in the future. No, I don't think Americans, after the debate that we've had, are ever going to turn to the United States government and say, why didn't you increase the powers of the NSA or keep it the same? Americans, polls show, clearly want serious reform, and that's what I think democratic leaders in a democracy ought to be responding to.
Glenn, lastly, I don't know if you've heard from Ed Snowden since the president's speech, but if you have, tell us about it. And if not, I know you do communicate with him on occasion. Has he gotten any measure of satisfaction from the fact that the president is being forced to address this, make some changes?
I mean, I'll let him speak for himself through his representatives. But what I will say is I do speak with him regularly, and he's been incredibly gratified by the debate, not only in the United States, but around the world, that has been obviously triggered exclusively by the courageous whistleblowing that he's done, by the seriousness with which governments and populations around the world have taken this debate, and the very bipartisan movement in the U.S. government. There aren't very many bipartisan movements these days, but there is a serious bipartisan coalition in the U.S. Congress to impose real limits on what the government can do to our privacy, and he's extremely gratified and I think proud by the role that he played in triggering that debate.
Glenn Greenwald, thank you so much for your time.
Glenn, do you believe the president went far enough in what he said today?
No, not remotely. I mean, there were a few proposals that I think are positive steps in the right direction, but the crux of the NSA controversy, which is why should the communications data of hundreds of millions, in fact billions of people every day, be collected and stored and have the potential to be monitored and analyzed, has really been left unanswered by the president by his speech. That is an activity that the NSA will continue even if all of his proposals are implemented. Mr.
Carr, what did you make of what the president said today? Because a lot of these surveillance measures were started on your watch during the Bush administration.
Well, I want to see a president have all of the tools that he needs to protect the country. So I think that President Obama actually did a courageous thing today. I'm not sure that I agree with every aspect of his recommendation, and he kind of dodged one particular challenge, is where do you store the data. But I think in basic, he protected the ability for a president to have this tool to make important decisions about protecting America. I do not see it as a potential for abuse if you store the data in the right place and you make sure that people who have access to the data have access only for that reason of protecting the country. I don't want it to be used to spy on American citizens. I do think it's important that the president have the ability to understand the nature of communication within the terrorist networks and have that tool available so that he can prevent an attack.
Glenn, what about that?
Andy Card, of all people, saying that there's really no reason to worry about abuse, given that the administration of which he was a part got caught breaking the law when the New York Times, which they won a Pulitzer Prize for disclosing, reported that his administration was spying on the telephone calls of Americans without the warrants required. And of course, we now have the metadata program, which a federal judge appointed by President Bush said was a profound violation of the Fourth Amendment, and even the president's own handpicked panel said that this metadata program doesn't actually play any sort of role at all in disrupting terrorist plots. It is domestic spying. It is the government collecting a list of all the people with whom we're communicating, how long we communicate, who we call, and anybody who thinks that that isn't spying or an invasion of privacy should just post to the internet every month the list of the people with whom they're communicating. Nobody would do that precisely because it is such an invasion of privacy, and it's time that program stopped.
Andy, I want you to be able to respond.
Your comments are a bit naive because it's not the way reality is really functioning. There was no interest in spying on American citizens. There was an interest in collecting communications, using an algorithm to understand what kind of communication and if there was a way to better protect America.
But Andy, even it was controversial even back under the Bush administration, the surveillance measures there was this issue of you and then White House counsel Alberto Gonzales were accused by then Attorney General John Ashcroft's number 2, the guy who's now director of the FBI, of trying to get the Attorney General to reauthorize certain measures while he was in the hospital. He refused to do so. So even back then, among Republicans, there was concern about the illegality of this program.
This program did not become declassified until December 21st of last year, so December 21st, 2013. I have not spoken about that incident at the hospital. There was no effort to get John Ashcroft to sign something over his objection, and as soon as we learned that he was not the Attorney General, we turned and left. But that's beyond that. I'm going to say the concerns that were raised were all addressed by the president, and there was no effort to have everybody resign at the Justice Department. So this is something that has worked very, very well. We've learned as we've done it. It is controversial. I have more confidence in the government doing the right thing than those who are afraid that it will do the wrong thing.
Glenn, one of the recent rulings in a federal court said, the judge said that the metadata program might have helped prevent the 9/11 attacks if they'd been able to intercept a call from the United States to an al-Qaeda safe house in Yemen. I know there was a New American Foundation report that pushed back on the effectiveness of the whole program, but at least as far as the courts are concerned, I mean, it seems unclear if these programs have helped the United States or not. I mean, you say clearly they haven't, but this judge seemed to think otherwise.
Ponderance of evidence, including from Judge Leon, who again is a right-wing judge appointed by the Bush administration, who said that he kept asking the Justice Department for evidence that these programs stop terrorism and they could provide no evidence. The White House Commission, filled with loyalists of the national security state, including the former deputy director of the CIA, Mike Morrell, said the same thing, that there's no evidence that this program is necessary to stop terrorism. There was one federal judge who accepted the government's claim that it could have helped stop 9/11, but two leading al-Qaeda experts in the last 3 weeks, Anderson, Peter Bergen, who is, I believe, an analyst at CNN, and Lawrence Wright, who wrote the definitive book on al-Qaeda in the New Yorker, said that those claims are absurd, that the 9/11 Commission made clear that the U.S. government had in its possession all of the information it would have needed to know about the 9/11 attack. Of course, President Bush famously got a memo saying bin Laden intends to strike within the United States, but they had so much data about people they were spying on that they couldn't connect the dots and even know what they had. And the solution was to spy on even more people, to gather even more evidence. And instead of focusing on terrorists, to collect data indiscriminately about billions of people every day around the world. And that actually makes it harder to detect terrorist plots than if you're focused on actual terrorists, which is what shows these programs actually don't help stop terrorism, as courts and panels and experts have all said.
Oh, how I wish you could sit in a seat to do the job of protecting the country. The president has a tough job. I want to help the president do his job protecting the country. The legislative branch acts for the future. Judges act by reflecting on the past. The president has to deal with the reality of today. And I watch presidents do that. I have confidence that they can do a good job, and this is a valuable tool for them to be able to protect the country.
Mr. Carter, the president...
The oath that the president takes when they get inaugurated is to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, one part of which is the Fourth Amendment that says that we are supposed to be safe from being searched and seized by the government without probable cause, not having all of our communications data collected, monitored, and analyzed, even though there's no evidence of wrongdoing. That's the responsibility and oath of the president according to the Constitution.
And that's why I would not like to see this migrate to the domestic side. I don't want it migrating to the domestic side.
Mr. Carter, I got to ask you, though, the president would not have been making comments today had Edward Snowden not revealed what he has so far revealed through Glenn Greenwald and others. Do you believe Snowden is a traitor? Do you believe he should face prison time?
I believe that he is a criminal. I believe that he violated his oath of office. He violated his security clearances, and he should be held accountable for that. And I think that his acts were not good for the country, not good for the United States, not good for our effort to protect the country, and not good for our efforts to bring diplomacy to the point that it can help to mitigate problems that might affect our national security.